welcome back to our chapter book read-along of Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. We are now on chapter 9 and 10. I have really been enjoying this story, and I hope you have too. But I think we need a quick review. Are you ready? Let's take a quick look through what we have read so far. Our four main characters are the children Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. They are siblings, and they are now staying at a big old house outside of London in the country during World War II. An old professor lives there and is now taking care of them. Well, they explore this huge, cool new house, and Lucy finds a wardrobe that leads her into a magical land called Narnia. There, she meets Mr. Tumnus, who is a faun, and he and her become friends. Well, at first, Mr. Tumnus, before he learned how nice and kind Lucy is, he was going to betray her to the White Witch, who claims to be the Queen of Narnia. She makes it always winter there and rules not kindly. Well, Mr. Tumnus decides not to take her to her and brings her back home, and so Lucy is able to go through the wardrobe and come back to her siblings. Well, no time has passed, so her siblings don't really believe her, especially when they go in the wardrobe and nothing's there but the back of the wardrobe. Well, time goes on. Eventually, Lucy and now Edmund and the other two siblings are playing hide and seek. Lucy goes in there, and Edmund, meaning to kind of bug her about it, follows her into the wardrobe. Then he also gets into Narnia. Well, Lucy goes and sees Mr. Tumnus, and Edmund meets the White Witch. She makes some promises about how he will be king and get some food that she has given him that is magic, makes him want more, if he brings all of his siblings to her. He needs all of them, not just Edmund, all of the siblings. Well, Lucy and Edmund meet up again, and they go back out. Edmund denies that he was actually there to the older two siblings, which of course makes Lucy upset. Well, Peter and Susan are worried about Lucy and think she's just kind of making up this odd story, but the professor, who they talk to, thinks that she might be telling the truth, and they should believe her or just kind of let her be, not bug her about it. Well, eventually, all four of the siblings are looking for a hiding place while they're trying to get away from the housekeeper, and they find themselves in the wardrobe, and eventually in Narnia. All four of them go in and wear some big old fur coats, and they trudge off to see Mr. Tumnus and have some tea with him. Problem is, Mr. Tumnus isn't there. His house has been trashed, and he has been taken by the police Morgrim, the head of the police, of the White Witch. Well, the children don't know exactly what they want to do, but Lucy convinces them that they need to go and save him. He risked everything to save Lucy, so they should at least try to save him. They trudge off following a little bird who was trying to give them directions, and they meet up with Mr. Beaver, and then follow Mr. Beaver to his house, where Mrs. Beaver is there as well. They are there to take care of him, and were good friends of Mr. Tumnus. They feed them some food, and then tell them all about what is going to happen. Aslan is coming, who is the real king of Narnia. He's also a giant lion. Pretty cool. And he will defeat the White Witch and restore Narnia to what it should be. Also, the four children are prophesied to sit on the throne in Cair Paravel and help rule Narnia as well. Well, the other thing that happens is Edmund betrays them, sneaks out of the Beaver's house, and goes to the witch. Well, I hope he's okay, even though he's trying to betray them. But we will see exactly what comes next of Edmund in our next chapter of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. Enjoy! Chapter 9. In the Witch's House. And now, of course, you want to know what had happened to Edmund. He had eaten his share of dinner, but hadn't really enjoyed it because he was thinking of Turkish delight. And there's nothing that spoils the taste of good, ordinary food half so much as the memory of bad magic food. And he had heard the conversation and hadn't enjoyed it much either, because he kept on thinking that the others were taking no notice of him and trying to give him the cold shoulder. They weren't, but he imagined it. And then he had listened until Mr. Beaver told them about Aslan, and until he had heard the whole arrangement for the meeting. Aslan at the stone table. It was then that he began very quietly to edge himself under the curtain which hung over the door. For the mention of Aslan gave him a mysterious and horrible feeling, just as it gave the others a mysterious and lovely feeling. Just as Mr. Beaver had been repeating the rhyme about Adam's flesh and Adam's bone, Edmund had been very quietly turning the door handle. And just before Mr. Beaver had begun telling them that the White Witch wasn't really human at all, but half djinn and half giantess, Edmund had gotten outside into the snow and cautiously closed the door behind him. You mustn't think that even now Edmund was quite so bad that he actually wanted his brother and sisters to be turned into stone. He did want Turkish delight, and to be a prince, and later a king, and to pay Peter out for calling him a beast. As for what the witch would do to the others, he didn't want her to be particularly nice to them, certainly not to put them on the same level as himself, but he managed to believe, or to pretend he believed, that she wouldn't do anything very bad to them. Because, he said to himself, all these people who say nasty things about her are her enemies, and probably half of it isn't true. She was jolly nice to me anyway, much nicer than they are. I expect she's the rightful queen, really. Anyway, she'll be better than that awful Aslan. At least, that was the excuse he made in his own mind for what he was doing. It wasn't a very good excuse, however, for deep down inside him, he really knew that the White Witch was bad and cruel. The first thing he realized when he got outside and found the snow falling around him was that he had left his coat behind in the beaver's house. And of course, there was no chance of going back now. The next thing he realized was that the daylight was almost gone, for it had been nearly 3 o'clock when they sat down to dinner, and the winter days are short. He hadn't reckoned on this, but he had to make the best of it. So he turned up his collar and shuffled across the top of the dam. Luckily, it wasn't so slippery, since the snow had fallen, to the far side of the river. It was pretty bad when he reached the far side. It was growing darker every minute, and what with that and the snowflakes swirling all around him, he could barely see 3 feet ahead. And then, too, there was no road. He kept slipping into deep drifts of snow and skidding on frozen puddles and tripping over fallen tree trunks and sliding down steep banks and barking his shins against rocks till he was wet and cold and bruised all over. The silence and the loneliness were dreadful. In fact, I really think he might have given up on the whole plan and gone back and owed up and made friends with the others if he hadn't happened to say to himself, "When I'm king of Narnia, the first thing I shall do is make some decent roads." And of course, that had set him off thinking about being king and all other things he would do, and this cheered him up a great deal. He had just settled in his mind what sort of palace he would have, and how many cars, and all about his private cinema, and where the principal railways would run, and what laws he would make against beavers and dams, and was putting the finishing touches to some schemes for keeping Peter in his place, when the weather changed. First, the snow stopped. Then a wind sprang up, and it became freezing cold. Finally, the clouds rolled away, and the moon came out. It was a full moon, and, shining on that snow, made everything almost as bright as day. Only the shadows were rather confusing. He would never have found his way if the moon hadn't come out by the time he got to the other river. You remember he had seen, when they first arrived at the Beavers, a smaller river flowing into the great one lower down. He now reached this and turned to follow it up. But the little valley down which it came was much steeper and rockier than the one he had just left, and much overgrown with bushes, so that he could not have managed it at all in the dark. Even as it was, he got wet through, for he had to stoop under branches, and great loads of snow came sliding off onto his back. And every time this happened, he thought more and more how he hated Peter, just as if all this had been Peter's fault. But at last he came to a part where it was more level and the valley opened out. And there, on the other side of the river, quite close to him, in the middle of a little plain between two hills, he saw what must be the White Witch's house. And he saw the moon was shining brighter than ever. The house was a really small castle. It seemed to be all towers, little towers with long pointed spires on them, sharp as needles. They looked like huge dunce caps or sorcerer's caps, and they shone in the moonlight, and their long shadows looked strange on the snow. Edmund began to be afraid of the house. But it was too late to think of turning back now. He crossed the river on the ice and walked up to the house. There was nothing stirring, not the slightest sound anywhere. Even his own feet made no noise on the deep, newly fallen snow. He walked on, past corner after corner of the house, and past turret after turret to find the door. He had to go right around to the far side before he found it. It was a huge arch, but the great iron gates stood wide open. Edmund crept up to the arch and looked inside into the courtyard, and there he saw a sight that nearly made his heart stop beating. Just inside the gate, with the moonlight shining on it, stood an enormous lion, crouched as if it was ready to spring. And Edmund stood in the shadow of the arch, afraid to go on and afraid to go back, with his knees knocking together. He stood there so long that his teeth would have been chattering with cold, even if they had not been chattering with fear. How long this really lasted, I don't know, but it seemed to Edmund to last for hours. Then at last he began to wonder why the lion was standing so still, for it hadn't moved 1 inch since he first set eyes on it. Edmund now ventured a little nearer, still keeping in the shadow of the arch as much as he could. He now saw from the way the lion was standing that it couldn't have been looking at him at all. But supposing it turns its head, thought Edmund. In fact, it was staring at something else, namely a little dwarf who stood with his back to it, about 4 feet away. Aha, thought Edmund, when it springs at the dwarf, then shall be my chance to escape. But still the lion never moved, nor did the dwarf. And now, at last Edmund remembered what the others had said about the White Witch turning people into stone. Perhaps it was only a stone lion. And as soon as he thought of it, he noticed that the lion's back and the top of its head were covered with snow. Of course it must be only a statue. No living animal would have let itself get covered with snow. Then very slowly, and with his heart beating as if it would burst, Edmund ventured up to the lion. Even now he hardly dared to touch it, but at last he put out his hand, very quickly, and did. It was cold stone. He had been frightened of a mere statue. The relief which Edmund felt was so great that in spite of the cold, he suddenly got warm all over, right down to his toes. And at the same time, there came into his head what seemed a perfectly lovely idea. Probably, he thought, this is that great Iron Aslan that they were all talking about. She's caught him already and turned him into stone. So, that's the end of their fine ideas about him. Pooh, who's afraid of Aslan? And he stood there gloating over the stone lion, and presently he did something very silly and childish. He took a stump of a lead pencil out of his pocket and scribbled a mustache on the lion's upper lip, then a pair of spectacles on his eyes. Then he said, "Ha, silly old Aslan, how do you like being a stone? You thought yourself mighty fine, didn't you?" But in spite of the scribbles on it, the face of the great stone lion beast still looked so terrible and sad and noble, staring up at the moonlight, that Edmund didn't really get any fun out of jeering at it. He turned away and began to cross the courtyard. As he got to the middle of it, he saw that there were dozens of statues all about, standing here and there, rather as the pieces standing on a chessboard when it's halfway through the game. There were stone satyrs, stone wolves, and bears, and foxes, and cat-a-mountains of stone. There were lovely stone shapes that looked like women, but who were really the spirits of trees. There was the great shape of a centaur, and a winged horse, and a long, lithe creature that Edmund took to be a dragon. They all looked so strange, standing there perfectly lifelike, and also perfectly still, in the bright, cold moonlight, that it was eerie. Crossing the courtyard. Right in the very middle stood a huge shape like a man, but as tall as a tree, with a fierce face and a shaggy beard and a great club in its right hand. Even though he knew that it was only a stone giant and not a live one, Edmund did not like going past it. He now saw that there was a dim light showing from a doorway on the far side of the courtyard. He went to it. There was a flight of stone steps going up to the open door. Edmund went up to them. Across the threshold lay a great gray wolf. "It's all right, he kept saying to himself. "It's only a stone wolf. It can't hurt me." And he raised his leg to step over it. Instantly, the huge creature rose, and with the hair bristling along its neck, opened a great red mouth and said in a growling voice, "Who's there? Who's there? Stand still, stranger, and tell me who you are." "If you please, sir," said Edmund, trembling so that he could hardly speak, "my name is Edmund. I'm the son of Adam that Her Majesty met in the wood the other day, and I've come to bring her the news that my brothers and sisters are now in Narnia, quite close at the beaver's house. She wanted to see them." "I will tell Her Majesty," said the wolf. "Meanwhile, stand still on the threshold, as you value your life." Then it vanished into the house. Edmund stood and waited, his fingers aching with cold and his heart pounding in his chest. And presently the gray wolf, Morgrim, the chief of the witches' secret police, came bounding back and said, come in, fortunate favorite of the queen, or else not so fortunate." And Edmund went in, taking great care not to tread on the wolf's paws. He found himself in a long, gloomy hall with many pillars, full, as the courtyard had been, of statues. The one nearest the door was a little faun with a very sad expression on his face, and Edmund couldn't help wondering if this might be Lucy's friend. The only light came from a single lamp, and close beside it sat the White Witch. "I've come, your Majesty," said Edmund, rushing eagerly forward. "How dare you come alone?" said the witch in a terrible voice. "Did I not tell you to bring the others with you?" "Please, your Majesty," said Edmund, "I've done the best I can. I brought them quite close. They're in the little house on top of the dam, just up the river, with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver." A slow, cruel smile came across the witch's lips. "Is this all your news?" she asked. "No, your Majesty," said Edmund, and proceeded to tell her all he had heard before leaving the beaver's house. "What? Aslan?" cried the queen. "Aslan, is this true? If I find you've lied to me—" Please, I'm only repeating what they said, stammered Edmund. But the queen, who was no longer attending to him, clapped her hands. Instantly, the same dwarf whom Edmund had seen with her before appeared. Make ready our sledge, ordered the witch, and use the harness without bells. Chapter 10. The spell begins to break. Now we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the 3 other children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There is no time to lose," everyone began bundling themselves into coats, except Mrs. Beaver, who started picking up snacks and laying them on the table, and said, "Now, Mr. Beaver, just reach down that ham, and here's a packet of tea, there's sugar and some matches, and if someone will get 2 or 3 loaves out of the crock over in the corner." "What are you doing, Mrs. Beaver?" exclaimed Susan. "Packing a load for each of us, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver very coolly. "You didn't think we'd set out on a journey with nothing to eat, did you?" "But we haven't got time," said Susan, buttoning the collar of her coat. "She may be here any minute." "That's what I say," chimed in Mr. Beaver. "Get along with you all," said his wife. "Think it over, Mr. Beaver. She can't be here for another quarter hour at least." "But don't we want as big a start as we can possibly get," said Peter, "if we're to reach the stone table before her?" "You've got to remember that, Mrs. Beaver," said Susan. "As soon as she looked in here and finds we're gone, she'll be off at top speed." "That she will," said Mrs. Beaver, "but we can't get there before her, whatever we do, or she'll be on a sledge and we'll be walking." "Then have we no hope?" said Susan. "Now don't you get fussing there, dear," said Mrs. Beaver, "but just get half a dozen clean handkerchiefs out of the drawer. Of course we've got a hope. We can't get there before her, but we can keep under cover and go by ways she won't expect, and perhaps we'll get through." "That's true enough, Mrs. Beaver," said her husband, "but it's time we're out of this." "And don't you start fussing either, Mr. Beaver," said his wife. "There, that's better. There's 5 loads and the smallest for the smallest of us. That's you, my dear," she added, looking at Lucy. "Oh, do please come on," said Lucy. "Well, I'm nearly ready now," answered Mrs. Beaver at last, allowing her husband to help her into her snow boots. "I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring?" "Yes, it is," said Mr. Beaver. "A great deal too heavy. And you don't think you'll be able to use it while we're on the run, I suppose?" "I can't abide the thought of the witch finding it," said Mrs. Beaver, "and breaking it or stealing it, as likely as not." "Oh, please, please hurry," said the 3 children. And so at last they all got outside, and Mr. Beaver locked the door. "It'll delay her for a bit," he said. And they set off, all carrying their loads over their shoulders. The snow had stopped, and the moon had come out when they began their journey. They went in single file, first Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan, then Mrs. Beaver last of all. Mr. Beaver led them across the dam and to the right bank of the river, and then along a very rough sort of path among the trees right down to the river bank. The sides of the valley, shining in the moonlight, towered up far above them on either hand. "Best keep down here as much as possible," he said. "She'll have to keep to the top, for she couldn't bring a sledge down here." It would have been pretty enough scene to look at through a window from a comfortable armchair, and even as things were, Lucy enjoyed it at first. But they went on walking, and walking, and walking. And as the sack she was carrying felt heavier and heavier, she began to wonder how she was going to keep up at all. And she stopped looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river with its waterfalls of ice, and at the white masses of treetops, and the great glaring moon, and the countless stars, and could only watch the little short legs of Mr. Beaver going pat, 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 pat through the snow in front of her, as if they were never going to stop. Then the moon disappeared, and the snow began to fall once more. And at last Lucy was so tired that she was almost asleep and walking at the same time, when suddenly she found that Mr. Beaver had turned away from the riverbank to the right and was leading them steeply uphill into the very thickest bushes. And then she came fully awake, and she found that Mr. Beaver was just vanishing into a little hole in the bank, which had been almost hidden under the bushes until you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realized what was happening, only his short, flat tail was showing. Lucy immediately stooped down and crawled in after him. Then she heard noises of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her, and in a moment all 5 of them were inside. "Whatever is this?" said Peter's voice, sounding tired and pale in the darkness. I hope you know what I mean by a voice sounding pale. "It's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times," said Mr. Beaver. "It's a great secret. It's not much of a place, but we must get a few hours' sleep." "If you hadn't all been such a plaguey fuss when we were starting, you'd have brought some pillows," said Mrs. Beaver. It wasn't nearly such a nice cave as Mr. Tumnus's, Lucy thought, but just a hole in the ground and dry and earthy. It was very small, so that when they all lay down, they were all a bundle of clothes together. And what with that and being warmed up by their long walk, they were really rather snug. If only the floor of the cave had been a little smoother. Then Mrs. Beaver handed round in the dark a little flask out of which everyone drank something. It made one cough and sputter a little and stung the throat, but it also made you feel deliciously warm after you swallowed it, and everyone went straight to sleep. It seemed to Lucy only the next minute, though it was really hours and hours later, when she woke up feeling a little cold and dreadfully stiff, and thinking how she would like a hot bath. Then she felt a set of long whiskers tickling her cheek, and saw the cold daylight coming in through the mouth of the cave. But immediately after, she was very wide awake indeed, and so was everyone else. In fact, they were all sitting up with their mouths and eyes wide open, listening to a sound which was the very sound they'd all been thinking of, and sometimes imagining they heard, during their walk last night. It was the sound of jingling bells. Mr. Beaver was out of the cave like a flash the moment he heard it. Perhaps you think, as Lucy thought for a moment, that it was a very silly thing to do? But it was really a very sensible one. He knew he could scramble to the top of the bank among the bushes and brambles without being seen. He wanted above all things to see which way the witch's sledge went. The others all sat in the cave waiting and wondering. They waited nearly 5 minutes. Then they heard something that frightened them very much. They heard voices. "Oh," thought Lucy, "he's been seen. She's caught him." Great was their surprise when a little later they heard Mr. Beaver's voice calling to them from just outside the cave. "It's all right," he's shouting. "Come out. Mrs. Beaver, come out, sons and daughters of Eve. It's all right. It isn't her." This was bad grammar, of course, but it's how beavers talk when they're excited. I mean, in Narnia. In our world, they don't usually talk at all. So Mrs. Beaver and the children came bundling out of the cave, all blinking in the daylight, and with earth all over them, and looking very frosty and unbrushed and uncombed with the sleep in their eyes. "Come on," cried Mr. Beaver, who was almost dancing with delight. "Come and see. This is a nasty knock for the witch. It looks as if her power is already crumbling." "What do you mean, Mr. Beaver?" panted Peter, as they all scrambled up the steep bank of the valley together. "Didn't I tell you," answered Mr. Beaver, "that she always made it winter and never Christmas? Didn't I tell you? Well, just come and see." And then they were all at the top and did see. It was a sledge, and it was reindeer with bells on their harnesses, but they were far bigger than the witch's reindeer, and they were not white but brown. And on the sledge sat a person whom everyone knew the moment they set eyes on him. He was a huge man with a bright red robe, bright as holly berries, with a hood that had fur inside it and a great white beard that fell like foamy waterfall over his chest. Everyone knew him because, though you see people of this sort only in Narnia, you see pictures of them and hear them talked about even in our world. the world on this side of the wardrobe door. But when you really see them in Narnia, it is rather different. Some of the pictures of Father Christmas in our world make him look only funny and jolly, but now that the children actually stood looking at him, they didn't find it quite like that. He was so big and so glad and so real that they all became quite still. They felt very glad, but also very solemn. "I've come at last," said he. "She has kept me out for a long time, but I have got in at last. Aslan is on the move. The witch's magic is weakening." And Lucy felt running through her that deep shiver of gladness which you only get when you are being solemn and still. "And now," said Father Christmas, "for your presents. There is a new and better sewing machine for you, Mrs. Beaver. I will drop it in your house as I pass."
"If you please, sir," said Mrs. Beaver, making a curtsy, "it's locked up."
"Locks and bolts have no difference for me," said Father Christmas. "And as for you, Mr. Beaver, when you get home, you will find your dam finished and mended, and all the leaks stopped, and a new sluice gate fitted." Mr. Beaver was so pleased that he opened his mouth very wide and then found he couldn't say anything at all. "Peter, Adam's son," said Father Christmas. "Here, sir," said Peter. "These are your presents," was the answer. "And they are tools, not toys. The time to use them is perhaps near at hand. Bear them well." With these words he handed Peter a shield and a sword. The shield was the color of silver, and across it ramped a red lion, as bright as ripe strawberry at the moment when you pick it. The hilt of the sword was of gold, and it had a sheath and a sword belt and everything it needed, and it was just the right size and weight for Peter to use. Peter was silent and solemn as he received these gifts, for he felt they were a very serious kind of present. "Susan, Eve's daughter," said Father Christmas, "these are for you." He handed her a bow and a quiver full of arrows and a little ivory horn. "You must use the bow only in great need," he said, "for I do not mean you to fight in the battle. It does not easily miss, and when you put this horn to your lips and blow it, then, wherever you are, I think help of some kind will come to you." Last of all, he said, "Lucy, Eve's daughter," and Lucy came forward. He gave her a little bottle of what looked like glass, but people said afterward that it was made of diamond, and a small dagger. "In this bottle," he said, "there is a cordial made of the juice of one of the fire flowers that grow in the mountains of the sun. If you or any of your friends is hurt, a few drops of this will restore them, and the dagger is to defend yourself at great need, for you also are not to be in the battle."
"Why, sir," said Lucy, I don't know, but I think I could be brave enough."
"That is not the point. But battles are ugly when women fight. And now," here he suddenly looked less grave, "here is something for the moment for you all." And he brought out, I suppose from the big bag at his back, but nobody quite saw him do it, a large tray containing 5 cups and saucers, a bowl of lump sugar, a jug of cream, and a great big teapot, all sizzling and piping hot. He cried out, "Merry Christmas! Long live the true king!" He cracked his whip, and he and the reindeer and the sledge, and all were out of sight before anyone realized that they had started. Peter had just drawn his sword out of his sheath and was showing it to Mr. Beaver, when Mrs. Beaver said,
Now then, don't stand talking there till the tea's got cold, just like men. Come and help and carry the tray down, and we'll have breakfast. What a mercy I thought of bringing the bread knife."
So down the steep bank they went, and back to the cave, and Mr. Beaver cut some of the bread and the ham into sandwiches, and Mrs. Beaver poured out the tea, and everyone enjoyed themselves. But long before they had finished enjoying themselves, Mr. Beaver said, "Time to be moving on now." All right, let's discuss the chapters that we just read. First is chapter 9, in the witch's house. Why hadn't Edmund enjoyed his dinner? He was thinking of the witch's Turkish delight. That very delicious dessert that she gave him was magical and made him want even more. So, yes, the food was good, but he didn't really taste it, did he? When did he actually slip out of the beaver's house? Right after he learned where they were going to meet Aslan. Oh boy. He snuck out. No one heard him. What were some of the excuses he made up about the witch in his own mind? What do you think? Maybe that people just say nasty things about her because they're her enemies. And they don't really know how she is. She was nice enough to him, right? She said that she would be nice to his siblings and take care of him. So why shouldn't he trust her? What cheered him up? What did he think about while he was walking through the snow without a coat to go to the witch's house? Thinking about all the things he was going to do as the King of Narnia. How was he able to find his way to the house? It was really, really tall, so he could see the house off in the distance. But he knew he had to follow one of the rivers because it flowed down. That's what the witch told him to follow. What frightened Edmund just outside the courtyard gate? Trying to find a picture. What frightened him? Do you remember? A stone lion. And he didn't notice at first that there was snow on the lion, right? So he thought it was a real lion. Would have scared me too. How did the witch greet him when he finally walked in? How did she greet him? Do you remember? How dare you come alone? So not very nicely. I don't think, not good. We'll have to see. Was not very happy. All right. Couple more thinking questions here. Why do you think Edmund was determined to go to the witch, even though he knew deep down that she is evil? I think a bit of it is that magic food that she gave him, and so he really, really wanted that, and that was kind of also underlying all of his other thoughts, which was he would like to be kind of in charge of his siblings and in charge of a country, not have to share anything with them. There could be lots of reasons. Do you think he really believed that the stone lion was Aslan? I don't know. He was taunting it, right? I think he wanted to believe it, but I don't think he truly believed that the lion was Aslan. What do you think of the way that the witch reacted to the news that Aslan is back? What do you think? She did not react well, right? She was angry and scared and didn't believe him at first either. I don't believe you. This can't be real. I'm a little surprised because it sounds like she has a lot of spies, and so she couldn't have known that he's not coming back at all. But Whew. I think she is a little bit scared of Aslan, which is a good thing for us, isn't it? All right, chapter 10 was called The Spell Begins to Break. And what was Mrs. Beaver doing while the others were bundling up? She was packing food. They would thank her later when they were hungry. Don't worry. She probably should have packed maybe less and just hustled a little faster, but oh well. What hope did she say they had? They had a pretty good amount of hope, right? Maybe not beating the witch to the stone table, but they'll definitely make it because they can go around in a different way that she can't because she's on a sled, right? Why did Mr. Beaver say that they should stay down in the valley? Same reason Mrs. Beaver said we had a little hope, right? So that's not where her sledge or her sleigh can go. So they can sneak in different places since they're walking, and that the sled cannot go. What awakened everyone from their sleep in the cave? Jingle bells, which usually is a happy sound, right? Except that that's sometimes what the witch had. Do you remember what they said at the end of the last chapter? The sleigh without bells. So it isn't the witch. Who was it? They call him Father Christmas, but it's Santa Claus. How cool is that? What are the gifts that each person in the group got? Mrs. Beaver got a new sewing machine. Mr. Beaver, his whole dam is fixed. So cool. Peter got a sword and a shield. Susan got a bow and arrow and a horn. And what did Lucy get? A little flask full of something that will heal anyone and a dagger. One critical thinking question. Do you think it was wise of Mrs. Beaver to take time to pack up supplies? Why or why not? What do you think? I think, and you can have a different opinion, please do. I would love to hear your opinion. But what I think is that, yes, it was a good idea to have some supplies, maybe not a full pack for every person, and maybe not having to pack the entire kitchen. I mean, once she talked about needing to bring the sewing machine, that we needed to draw the line there. But it was a good idea to have food and supplies. Well, those are all our questions for our chapters and our discussion. We hope that you have enjoyed these chapters of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and we will see you back here next time. Bye, everyone!